Good afternoon, everyone. Panelists, please take your seats. Thank you for your opening remarks, everyone. I was going to go through what the Great Acceleration was in my opening remarks, but I don't think I need to do that. It's been done several times already, so I'm going to go straight into the conversation with our panel. So this is the opening plenary, of course, and it's all about building preparedness in the age of acceleration. Everyone who's taking part here, by the way, and also whether you're in Geneva or whether you're watching this online, you can contribute to the conversation on social media by, if you just put in hashtag GESDA Summit into your messages, and then we can all see what's happening. So anyway, the age of acceleration has been described a range of things in different topics, from synthetic biology to AI to human augmentation, robotics, and climate change. The world has obviously been through lots of changes before, but it's hard to say that it's been through this many changes all at once. Never mind against the backdrop of some very shifting and uncertain geopolitics. Nobody really knows how the race between the various great powers of the world is going to shake out, and technology is an important part of deciding how that's going to function. So in the panel today, we have 4 speakers. You'll notice that one of our speakers is not here. Marcus Gabriel was unfortunately taken ill this morning, so he couldn't join us. We have 4 excellent speakers who will, in my first question to them, introduce themselves. I don't want to spend 10 minutes in telling you all of their amazing achievements. So I'm going to ask them all questions myself, and they will introduce themselves as part of the first questions. And then later on in the session, we're going to have some time for your questions as well. So I'm going to sit down first. I'm going to start by asking Subra, who's on my left. Subra, tell us a bit about who you are and your experience in research and beyond. And just talk to me about the historical context of all this. Help us to understand how science normally shapes the arrival and the sort of uses of technology.
Thank you. Thank you, Alok, and good afternoon, everyone. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm an engineer by training. Engineering scientist, and most of my career has been at MIT, culminating as Dean of Engineering. And then I moved into government and science policy as head of the National Science Foundation in Washington, D.C. during the Obama administration. And subsequently, I was president of Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh and Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. I've come full circle back to Boston, where now I have a research lab at MIT and do a few other things. To go back to your question, I think historically, if I just focus on what the National Science Foundation has done for science and its implications for society, it was founded in 1950. Since this is the Nobel Prize week, announcement week, since 1950, NSF-funded research until last week had produced 262 Nobel Prize winners, 262 by one agency. It's one of the smallest agencies. The societal impact of this is enormous. And somebody made a comment in the context of basic science funding, and it's a basic science agency whose mission is not to push any mission. Its mission is to fund the best people and the best ideas, give them time and space, and leave them alone. And somebody made a comment that good science can only be classified into 2 categories, and I underline the word good. Good science that has been applied, and the good science that has not yet been applied. And how long it takes depends on the particular application. But that's essentially what it is. So let me just, because it's about anticipation and acceleration of science, I just want to briefly mention 3 topics, 3 mega trends that have been on my mind related to science and society. Number 1, about 10, 12 years ago, the total basic R&D funding in the US for all branches of science was roughly comparable to the R&D funding by industry in the US. It was just 10, 12 years ago. Today, industry funds more than 3 times what the federal government funds. That's a significant change in just 1 decade. And that change has enormous implications on the openness of science, the application of science, the publication of science. And just because industry is funding more doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be available to humanity in broad numbers. That's the first point. The second point about the evolving science, and it was mentioned earlier in the context of AI, for the first time in history, the very question of what it means to be human and the very existence of humans is come under question. And science, therefore, has even a more urgent role than in the past, and that's why entities like GESDA are very, very critical. My last point is the word D in GESDA, diplomacy. When entities such as the National Science Foundation and other entities in Washington were created, diplomacy was front and center. As director of the National Science Foundation, I essentially acted as a science diplomat for the US government, carrying a diplomatic passport, engaging with all the embassies in Washington. And even that part has come under significant stress recently, because as we need to engage more and more openly, more and more walls have gone up, especially because of the science and technology wars that were mentioned earlier. So these 3 mega trends will play a very important role in how we address science and how we anticipate the trends in the not too distant future and the distant future.
Super, thank you. Let me stick with government for now and ask Patricia to do the next question. Patricia, at the State Department where you work, can you tell me how you prepare for the unknown? How do you anticipate what's going to happen, given that we don't know where science is going often?
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'm Patricia Gruber. I'm the Science and Technology Advisor to the U.S. Secretary of State. And in that role, my job is to anticipate the impact of technology developments on foreign policy. So this is a very appropriate question for me. And by the way, one of my greatest achievements is actually arriving here in spite of a flight delay, literally on time to walk up stage with my panelists. Happy to be here. Let me talk about the anticipate piece a little bit. So we have recently been thinking about how can we get ahead of technology a little bit better? How can we help our policymakers be a little bit less reactive? And so specifically, my office has been really looking across US agencies at how do they do horizon scanning. And it's interesting because some of them do it on a very sort of regular, 2-year, 4-year future look kind of basis. Some are more ad hoc. Some of them, but all of them, I would say, tap into expertise, science and technology expertise that they have access to either through government laboratories or their relationships with universities, such as the National Science Foundation. And so, we have a lot of sources for sort of forward-looking horizon scanning. Think tanks, as I said, our government laboratories, horizon scans that are put out by more, like the EU Commission, compendia like the GESDA radar. These are all really helpful. But what I've learned in my role is that, and some of our agencies use it for long-term resource planning. Some of them use them for mission planning, 10 years out, or system acquisition. In the foreign policy world, our time scales, it turns out, are more like months, not years, months, right? I would say 6 to 24 months. And we've seen that really tremendously in AI, for example. We weren't surprised by AI. We knew it was out there. We knew developments were happening. What surprised us was the speed of adoption, okay? And so I think the bottom line here is technology is always going to lead policy. I mean, that's just a fact of life. You really don't want it the other way around. You don't want policy driving discovery. So what that means is, in order for us to prepare our policy-making bodies, what we have to do is make sure that we have continuously work on fostering a science and technology ecosystem internationally that is open, transparent, allows for collaboration and allows for those discourse. It means that we have to use science diplomacy to build those relationships before we get caught by that ChatGPT moment. And those relationships have to be built and nurtured over time. And finally, of course, I have to say this, we have to implant science and technology expertise into our policy organizations. So for example, the second part of my job description is to build capacity, science and technology capacity in the State Department. So we rotate AAAS fellows, tenured faculty member fellows through the department to help our various offices with policy issues on a 1 to 2 year basis. So we're constantly getting new technology expertise into the building. We have regional technology officers who work in embassies around the world to do the domestic international ecosystem connections. And we even use students on a short-term, sort of voluntary basis. We have a diplomacy program where students will work for a semester on a policy problem for us. So we're reaching out to a lot of stakeholders to build that expertise in. And the last thing I will say about science advice is it's good to have a science advisor. I love my job. And that's important because you don't want the first time a policymaker and a scientist to talk to be when there's a technology policy issue, right? They have to work together, they have to learn to communicate with each other, and they need to build trust over time.
Thank you, Patricia. And I'm glad to hear that the mighty US State Department was surprised by the uses of generative AI and the speed of it, because I thought it was just me. I thought I'd missed something huge. Onno, coming to you next. How do the tech companies and entrepreneurs that you work with, how do they navigate this field? There's lots going on, there's lots of things changing. They're, of course, determined by how much money they can make and how successful their businesses can be. How do they navigate these things?
Well, maybe first I will explain what I do so that you understand my point of view. So I'm the CEO, one of the founders of Hello Tomorrow. So it's a very large network of scientists, entrepreneurs, investors, industrial, also government agencies. We run a big deep tech startup competition. We screen more than 5,000 startups every year. So we have a good idea of what's going on. And we also organize events to connect them with investors, corporates. And we also work through some consulting services. And we also recently created a fund to finance the best companies we see. And I think when we think about startups, entrepreneurs, individually, they are not better equipped than us to anticipate the future. But what is really strong is actually that it's really an ecosystem. So it's all over the world, every year, you have dozens of thousands of people that are working on the technology and face some issues in their life. They know some industries, so they made the connections. So you have all those people all over the world coming up with ideas at the intersection of science and society and industry. And it's this ecosystem really that is, as a whole, able to kind of anticipate the future. And then through natural selection somehow, only the project that makes sense will be financed by investors and so on. And I think it creates also a challenge for anyone that wants to predict the future, because it's not anymore maybe as it used to be a few decades ago, like big companies working with big research institutions that together will build the future. Today, the way the future is built is really through a very decentralized ecosystem. So this information about the future is really fragmented. So I think it calls for also different way of anticipating. And just to give a few examples, what we do when we work with some companies who want to, for example, recently a company who wanted to understand how they could test the toxicity of new compounds without using animals, because it's cruel and maybe there will be some legislation. And so rather than doing a kind of top-down study, okay, what exists and what I want to do, they just shared this challenge. We helped them share this challenge to engage with our community. And the entrepreneurs themselves came up with solutions that maybe in a more top-down approach we wouldn't have been able to anticipate. to use like organ on a chips or like in silico tests. I won't go into the details, but and this is also starting to. I see it also used in international organizations like the World Health Organization. During COVID, for example, they did also a very big call for application that we did with them for oxygen therapies. So I think this more ecosystemic and decentralized approach can be a good way to predict the future, to look at, because somehow it's already happening in the future, but it's more very fragmented, so very difficult to see.
Thanks, Arnaud. Tatiana, I'd like to come to you next. When thinking about the development and introduction and the adoption of new technologies, I guess a lot of people who are not necessarily involved in the research are curious how these things can be brought to the world in a sort of equitable way, in a way that doesn't infringe on human rights, in ways that maintain stability. And I guess this is where your organization comes in. What kinds of governance, what kinds of frameworks do you need to make sure that technology of the types we've been talking about is introduced and developed in a way that is good rather than bad?
Well, I'm Tatiana Valovaya. I'm Director General of United Nations Office here in Geneva. I'm not a scientist, but I am Professor of International Economy. And I've did lots of research on economic history, on the development of economic systems. And one thing is absolutely clear. It's a rare case when all the scientists agree that all the biggest changes in economic and social history and development of humankind were provoked by the breakthrough in science and technology. Each time it starts with science and technology, and then it's a social revolution or social revolution. And we all know that, for example, science and technology breakthrough in 18th century led to industrial revolution, which brought to life modern economic systems. And we all know that at that time, for people, it was not so easy to understand that the machines are stronger than them, that the machines, as they thought, are stealing their jobs. Now we are living in a much more challenging period. Machines are getting smarter than us, smarter than humans. Are we already prepared for this? What kind of international governance we need? What kind of international law we need? I'll give you a couple of very simple examples, shows how difficult it is to develop these new international agreements. It was just said, 25 years from now, people will be able to live and work on the moon. But do we have an international treaty which will guide us how we will use the moon, how we will use the resources, how we are going to mine there? No, we don't. We have the Outer Space Treaty, which is a very good treaty, but it's rather narrow in its aim. There is, as a result of also this treaty, there was an attempt to create a special moon treaty, which is very similar to the Antarctic Treaty. It was prepared, it was signed at the end of the 60s, but none of the countries who really invest and actively work in the space exploration are part of this treaty. But all these countries are developing their national legislation. So, exactly, we already have these technologies. We don't have to anticipate, we already know. But we don't know how the international community is going to react. Or another very simple example, very old technology, now very, very popular, cloud seeding. If you need, you can receive the rain from the cloud which is passing over your territory. It was used back in the 70s or the 20th century. But do we have now an international treaty which would prohibit, for example, somebody who would like to use the cloud to rain on its own territory, and thus preventing the cloud going over neighboring country? Very simple case, which is getting more and more urgent. We don't have international treaty. And it's very difficult to develop international treaty once the technology is already there. Once you have countries, once you have corporations who invested a lot. That's why it's so important to do it while you anticipate it at a very early stage. And we all hope that artificial intelligence will receive its properly international governance. As it was already said, in September, part of the Pact of the Future, the Global Digital Compact, was signed. And it's a first universal agreement that we really have to work together on managing, on governing the artificial intelligence. There is lots to be done. The implementation is the key. We'll have to create scientific, independent international scientific panel which would advise the member states on the developments. We'll have to initiate global dialogue on artificial intelligence. It's just the first step. But that's exactly the type of international governance we need when we have the technology which is already appearing or which will appear in 25, 30 years. We have to start very early, and really only with these international discussions, only with these international agreements, we'll be able to avoid new technological divides and really to use the technology and science for the benefit of the whole humankind.
Thank you, Tatiana. Subra, you know, when we talk about these technologies coming along, we sort of, there's an air of anticipation and kind of worry sometimes about this, but of course technologies can also be used to mitigate the effects and help in preparing people. So talk to me a little bit about how things like AI or digital platforms, advanced material science, how do these things play a role in preparing the world for the technology changes that are coming?
So if we look back to history and then anticipate the future, there are many, many examples where fundamental science in one technology, which took place and was funded through government, through private industry over a long period of time, has significantly changed day-to-day life of ordinary citizens in society in unanticipated ways many decades later. Good example is GPS. Even though it was initially part of espionage and government efforts and satellites and so forth, the fundamental science for that involved many, many universities and scientists, the 60s through the 90s. And at that time, just going back to the records of that funding, at least in the American context, nobody anticipated that we would all be carrying mobile devices in our pockets today that will precisely tell us where we are, and both the positives and negatives that come out of it. That's one example. You mentioned material science, the whole issue of semiconductor technology and putting so many billions and billions of transistors into a simple device. That wasn't anticipated, even though Moore's law predicted doubling of computer capacity every 18 months and reducing the price by 50%. Material science technologies in membrane technologies in water purification. I think one of the remarkable things about these different areas, and that's very much reflected, and it was mentioned earlier today, the way the Nobel Committee has been looking at science in interesting ways, is the boundaries between science are becoming so blurred. So a computer scientist can be a physics Nobel laureate, and other group of computer scientists could be chemistry Nobel laureates and so forth. And it's a remarkable time in science. And I think one of the exciting things right now in science is the fact that we cannot anticipate what some of the applications are going to be. And the time frame for missing the right target anticipation is getting shorter and shorter because the development is getting faster and faster. And the last point that I want to make is also to pick up on Arno's comments. The confluence of basic research, fundamental research, and innovation is also merging in ways both from actually from all sides, from government agencies, industry, and academia in new and unique ways. And I think that's going to even further accelerate innovation in ways in which we don't anticipate yet.
Well, Arnaud, just picking up on the point of innovation, companies of the type you're working for, their whole purpose is innovation, in a sense. And they have different models of innovation compared to government grants being given to researchers in academic labs. I'm curious to know how much of the models of innovation that you see in companies are being deployed beyond the entrepreneurial sort of world into places like government institutions, diplomatic places, and so on.
Well, the form of a startup, it's a temporary organization in a search of a match between the solution and a problem. So it's by nature, big organizations cannot really behave like startups, but what we see is they are both trying to connect with startups to create a continuum between academia, startup, and then big companies. With more or less success. It started, maybe 10, 15 years ago with creating a lab somewhere where, with fancy furnitures and, things totally useless to actually innovate. To today, I think what works the best is being clear of, okay, where I'm putting some budget, some teams, and some efforts to innovate, sharing those priorities with the startup world, and then letting the startups really find out, okay, what I can do really, and then working together, trying to be a bit more flexible in terms of ways of working than with their traditional suppliers. We see that happening again also in intergovernmental organizations. And I think really it's going to be, it's going to be the new value chain of innovation, most of the time going through startups before going to the industry in general. And the main reason about that is, I think, something maybe we don't realize, because we talk a lot about the advancement of science, but what is striking also is the cost of science that is decreasing. And today it's possible in pretty much any domain to create a prototype with just €1 million, which is what an investor will give to a company which is just out of a university. Maybe a few decades ago, that wouldn't be possible. So today, that's why you have some companies doing nuclear fusion, doing biotech, because you don't need a huge lab anymore. You can order DNA online. You can so the capex, the initial capital that you need to bring a very first version of a product in the hands of a potential customer is really small, and that's why startups are doing that in many, many fields today.
Okay, thank you, Arnaud. In a moment, I'm going to come to the audience for some questions. So if you've got any questions, do please put your hands up. And there are some microphones going around. So if the microphones can get ready, and maybe there's one question here and then one over on this side over here. If you just get them over. But before I come to you, I've got a couple more questions for Patricia and Tatiana about the sort of international collaboration aspect of all of this and where science fits in. Patricia, I'm curious to know from you, the State Department has an almost infinite shopping list of things it has to do every single day. Science is in there somewhere, right? But clearly we all know there are many, many other priorities mixed in. And I wonder how you at the department use science and scientific knowledge to try and reach beyond some of the political barriers that you must face every day.
Great question. Wow, how do I want to phrase this? So we use science and technology diplomacy at the State Department at a lot of different levels. So at a high level, we have a lot of bilateral. Let me talk about what I think science diplomacy does. First of all, it can do a lot of things. One thing, for example, is making sure that policy actually serves science, right? That policy can be used and diplomacy can be used to advance science. And we are sitting in the perfect example of that, which is CERN, because that takes a lot of diplomatic actions to happen across multiple countries. diplomacy also can help us build those science and technology relationships that I said before were very important. And in fact, it is a great communication tool that we can use even with countries where we don't necessarily see eye to eye geopolitically. So we can have those science conversations on kind of very neutral ground, if you will. The other thing that we do is, so we think about, or I think about science diplomacy at different levels. So at a high level, we engage in multilateral fora like the UN, various UN bodies, the G7, the G20, OECD, that sort of thing. And some of those high-level partnerships, for example, can drive programs that impact a lot of lives. So for example, our vision for adapted crops and soils, we started in 2023 in partnership with the African Union and the UN Food and Agriculture Organization to work on research to introduce climate-resistant, diverse crops and soils into different developing countries so that we can improve the yield and also the nutrition. So that's at a high level. But I used to come from a funding agency. I used to fund basic research myself. And so I am a big believer in what I call bottom-up science diplomacy. And that is about creating opportunities for researcher-to-researcher collaboration. So that can be through funding, symposia, workshops, conferences, networking. It's also through people exchanges. So, for example, the State Department are probably our most well-known people exchange programs are the Fulbright Scholar programs. So we do people exchanges. Our USAID agency also funds fundamental research, again, collaboration between US and foreign researchers. Over time, our peer program has funded more than 400 researchers in healthcare and health systems across more than 30 countries. So it's really about building that collaboration. And those collaborations tend to be very long-term and very sustained. And so, they build on themselves, and that's really important. I think the other thing that's really important to note in science diplomacy is it's a multi-stakeholder. We don't view it as just a government activity. We engage with stakeholders in civil society, national, subnational level, and a very important stakeholder that we engage with more and more now is the private sector. And why is that? Because more and more they are driving the direction of technology. Funding, from the private sector far exceeds government R&D expenditures now. And so we really need to work with our industry on that. And so make sure we're kind of on the same page, sharing the same guidelines and values. And a recent example that I'll give is just a couple of weeks ago at the UN High-Level General Assembly, Secretary Blinken President Biden announced a partnership with 9 large US AI companies to basically spend $100 million to try to provide more access to AI to developing countries. So that's computing access, that's building capacity by training on the technology, and also constructing more models in different languages.
Patricia, thank you. And Tatiana, the flip side of that question to you, there are many, many global challenges. You've highlighted some already that require international collaborations, whether it's pandemics, AI, all these things. Just very briefly, if you can, just talk to me about your role, your organization's role in trying to bring together people when there is geopolitical tension.
Well, as was already said, that without cooperation, without collaboration, we can't find a solution to any challenge we are facing today. And I fully support what Patricia has said. In times we are living now, in times of geopolitical divide, in times of conflicts, quite often governments do not talk directly to each other. But scientists might talk, young people might talk, women might talk. So in this time, we really have to use all the opportunities, and the United Nations is doing so, really to create an environment which is multilateral, but it's not just the monopoly of governments. Environment which is really inclusive and integrated. That's why, again, maybe returning to the Pact for the Future, Declaration on Future Generation, all this was prepared together with the civil society. It was not only the work which was done by the governments. Civil society, private sector, young people participated a lot, and they provided lots of impact. Yes, of course, these were the governments which had the final saying. But lots of things, lots of actions we have in these documents, they came from the civil society. Speaking about artificial intelligence, for example, Secretary General has created a special independent panel, a high-level advisory board, which really was meeting for the last several months, exactly preparing the suggestions which are now part of the Global Digital Compact. And once again, I would like to draw attention to the young people, to working with young people. Even when we talk around purely scientific issues, quite often where all the scientists see a risk, young people see a possibility. That's why it's so important to have this intergenerational dialogue. Otherwise, we will always have some kind of a saying, well, it's a very good technology, it's really very interesting, but it has lots of risk. Let's stop and think about it. And there will be other young scientists who will be developing it without paying attention to this. We really need to work together, young people and scientists, together with international organizations, to help us, well, to anticipate the future, to predict the future, but also, what's more important, to prepare us from the point of view of legal structures of governance to this future who will be exactly there.
Okay, Tatiana, thank you. We have 2.5 minutes left. So we're going to have, in the theme of this session, a very accelerated questions from the audience. So there's two here, one here, one here. Can we have both of your questions, please? And if you want to tell me who you are, and if you're directing the question to anyone in particular.
Who I am not sure, but my name is Boris Hengartner. I am a local journalist, freelance. Page 290 of the radar, there is a sentence, imprudent sentence, about the need to question long-standing what do you call dogma. It was about archaeology. What are the long-standing dogma to be questioned in physics, in biology, in mathematics, in informatics, and the like?
Okay, that's one question. Thank you. Is there another question over here?
Yeah.
Where are you?
Hello, my name is Vladimir. I'm representing Villar Institute. I've got a question for Patricia. You've talked about defining policy. Is there any problems with implementing policy and make sure that it abides, that scientific development abides by it?
Okay, thank you very much. We've got 1.5 minutes. You've got about 20 seconds each to conclude everything you want to say. Patricia, why don't you go first?
I didn't catch the end of your question about issues with science policy.
Implementing policy. Is there
Pardon
any
me?
problem? Are there any problems with implementing policy? I think the question was.
Oh, well, yeah, actually, that got to the second part of your question, which I didn't answer. The reality is there are a lot of demands on policymakers. And so if you're a science advisor or you're thinking about having science impact them, you have to be able to translate. I'm a translator, right? You have to be able to translate why they should care about science in terms of economic prosperity, security, or human rights. And so the barriers are, it's kind of breaking through the clutter, right, and to get your message out there. As far as questioning dogma, I think that at the end of the day, it's really all about collaboration, and that's not going to change.
Thank you, Patricia. Subra, questioning dogma.
Regarding policy, I think one of the challenges in those in charge of science policy and science funding is there is an enormous pressure to chase the latest fashion and the loudest trend that you'll see. And the classical particular example of this is Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon in 1969. And that's the Moonshot project, very well known. But the first patent to put wheels on a suitcase was filed a year after Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. And wheels on the suitcase are much more useful on day-to-day life. And it's a remarkable invention that was waiting to be created. And it took us all the way to go to the moon. So my policy suggestion would be individual ideas should not be ignored while we chase major dreams and major trends.
Okay, thank you. Briefly, Arno?
Yeah, it's about the way we want to control, and I've been talking about ecosystem, the fact that it comes also from a very decentralized ecosystem. In this case, it's not possible to control, and I think we also need to support entrepreneurs to help them understand what are the ethical consequences of their choices, because I can tell you, for being one myself and working with many of them, that there is absolutely no support when it comes to important ethical questions. You get more support to file your taxes right than to think about the deep ethical questions and consequences about what you're building, while I'm not sure that in terms of impact on society, it should be really that way. And letting that just to human nature, I think history showed that it's not always a good idea. So yes, I think providing more support to individuals on the ground and trying to influence, not just doing top-down regulation and laws is important.
Thank you. And Tatiana, last word to you.
Well, I would like to say that, for example, when we are talking about policy, funding, whatever, always we have to think about some initial legal framework. Because before we make investment, well, on the wheels of the suitcase, it's a very excellent example. Because that really helps everybody. But at the same time, lots of times we don't know what will be the consequences for human rights, what will be the consequences for ethics. For example, I belong to a generation which read lots novels of Isaac Asimov. And for me, as a girl, the first law of robotechnics, a robot can't kill a human, became something with which I grew up. So I was very much disappointed at a later stage to understand that we do not have an international treaty which would not allow artificial intelligence or autonomous systems to kill a person. So that exactly shows that, well, we have really to anticipate the consequences and to try to have at least some basic principles which will guide the research, the funding, the development.
Thank you, Tatiana. And can I just thank our panelists, Patricia, Tatiana, Arno, and Subra, for all of their insightful comments. I wish you would have asked more questions. I'm sure they'll be around as well later, so you can ask them yourself. I just want to say you can continue this conversation on social media by using the hashtag GESDA Summit. And the next session starting at 2:45 in this auditorium is called Unlocking Next Generation Neurotechnology Applications. But thank you all for taking part and for being here today.
Thank you.